Donc pour ce soir,
So
je vais
for this evening, and
tenter de vous partager
I'm
quelques
going to
réflexions
try and share a few
modestes,
reflections
car à vrai
in a
dire,
very modest way,
nous sommes dans
because
une question, si j'ose dire. Je vais parler d'un
I'm
sujet
going to talk about
éminemment sensible,
a very sensitive subject,
éminemment délicat, parfois
very
éminemment
delicate
passionnel.
and
Mais avant d'être passionnel, il est délicat,
subject of
parce qu'il concerne
passion,
des personnes.
because it has
Ces personnes
to
sont
do with
toujours des
people,
individus
and
singuliers,
these people are always
des histoires uniques.
individuals with unique
Donc
stories.
en parler en plus,
And so to talk
dans un
about
pays que je ne
that
connais
in
pas,
a country that I don't
je ne
know,
connais pas la culture,
of which I don't know the culture, of which I don't know the stories,
moins encore
and even less so here than in metropolitan France, I find the exercise very dangerous.
que demander votre indulgence,
So I'll be asking for your indulgence
mes connaissances, en espérant surtout ne pas vous blesser.
for my limited knowledge of the country, and I hope not to offend anyone.
À peu près des
And
oreilles. Si des choses
there's no need to scream, but if you're shocked or unsettled by anything, we can talk about them afterwards in our questions and answer session,
plus difficiles de pouvoir le...
because it's a very difficult exercise.
Alors, donc essayez de rendre
So
compte de comment, du sein
to
de la
try
vie chrétienne,
and talk
parce que
about
c'est
from
là où
within
nous
Christian
nous
life,
situons ce soir,
because this is our perspective for tonight, from within Christian life, and from the
par la Bible,
reflections offered by the Bible,
les évangiles,
by
la
the
manière
gospel,
de Jésus,
by Jesus'
et par la
way of
tradition de
living,
l'Église.
and by the church's tradition.
Comment rendre compte
How
d'une manière
can
de
we
penser,
talk about this way of
la
thinking
question de
and to think about the issue of
comment penser une
homosexuality?
manière d'être
How can we think about this way of being
personnes qui sont
with
homosexuelles.
people who are homosexual, to be with them?
Alors, je voudrais commencer là.
And I would like to start, but this is the easy part,
par vous rappeler,
by
si vous en
reminding you, if you
des propos de
don't remember,
François,
the words of our Pope Francis a few weeks ago.
première citation
First quote
lors de son
during
retour de son voyage
his return from
JMJ, au Brésil,
from Brazil.
Si vous en souvenez, il était
And
interrogé dans l'avion.
if you remember, he was interviewed on the plane, probably about this subject. I can't remember exactly what the journalist asked,
On
but
écrit beaucoup, dit-il, donc,
a lot
sur
is
l'idée,
written,
je ne l'ai pas encore trouvé. Je n'ai encore rencontré personne au Vatican.
I have
qui
never
montre
met
sa
anyone
capacité
in the
avec écrit
Vatican who'd shown me his
On doit
identity
distinguer
card
le
that
fait d'être
says gay.
homosexuel et
We
le fait
must make a
de faire partie
distinction between being homosexual or being part of a lobby, because
Personne
lobbies are not
homosexuelle,
good.
qui suis-je?
If a person is homosexual, then who am I to judge?
Le problème n'est pas d'avoir
The
cette
problem is not
tendance.
to have
Nous
this
devons
tendency.
être frères.
We must be brothers.
Et puis, plus récent
And
encore,
then, more recently,
dans l'interview
in the
qu'il vient
interview that
d'accorder
he gave
à
to
cette revue Jésus de par le monde,
Jesuit magazine
quelques jours,
a few days ago,
il dit ceci.
he says,
Vous verrez, le propos est très.
and you'll see that it's very short,
Il recommande donc dans cette
he
interview
recommends in this interview to accompany
les homosexuels et les divorcés
homosexuals and
à
divorcees with
partir de leurs conditions de vie réelles,
from their real living condition with compassion.
expliquant un peu plus loin
And he explains later
que nous devons
that
annoncer
we
l'évangile
must announce the gospel on all the
en
roads
annonçant la bonne nouvelle du royaume,
by bringing the good
soignant
news from the kingdom
également avec notre
and taking
prédication
care
tout type
through
de
our
maladie.
predication all kinds of diseases and all kinds of wounds.
Et juste auparavant, il dit
And just before that, he was saying, I'm sorry, I skipped a line.
l'Église
He said
d'aujourd'hui ne pouvait
that
seulement
today's
insister
church
sur les
can
questions
only
liées à
insist
l'avortement,
on the
mariage
issues
homosexuel
to
et
do with
usage
abortion,
des méthodes
marriage for
contraceptives.
all, and contraception.
Quand on en parle, dit-il,
And when we discuss this, we must do it in a certain
Dans
context.
cette interview,
So in that same interview that he mentions today's church as a kind of a country hospital,
s'occuper
which
de ce qui est le plus urgent,
care for the emergencies
aller mieux,
so
avant
that people
de
can
s'occuper
be better
du reste,
before the church takes care of anything else. And about homosexuality, he thinks that all Christians and beyond all Catholics and beyond know what the church is thinking. So it's about being welcoming, and it's a question of compassion. And of course, he doesn't question the doctrine, which everybody knows. So that's the easy part of putting forward these words, which are essential to us, maybe because they state several things. First, those the words of Jesus, "Who am I to judge? I don't judge anyone." That's what Jesus says in the Gospel. Who am I to judge? So it's not a question of not having any convictions. It's not about not being able to argue what one believes is the best way to live, the best for someone, the best for a society. But it's about being able to welcome the people, the persons, as they are. I have the difficulty, but also the joy of teaching ethics, moral theology, which is a discipline that is linked to the real world. And the basis is what people are. Because if we start from the point of what we would like people to be, we would never start. And we'll be left by the wayside. Because we will never be good enough, we will never be what we would like to be and what we would like others to be. So we have to start from what people actually are. So I don't judge anyone, that's what this means. Even more so, because what it's about here is, if we want to follow this decision, this conviction, I don't judge anyone, this requirement, it's great to say I don't judge anyone, so that the other can go towards what makes him live, to go towards life. I don't condemn you, says Jesus to the adulterous woman, go and sin no more. And I'm not making any comparisons here, but what's interesting is the attitude of Jesus, who says, go. This I don't judge anyone is in relation to the word go. And the other has to believe that he can go and move forward in his existence, to move forward with the belief that one's life can be good, can be happy. So according to gospel-based life and everyone's life, not good in any way or with anyone, but good, for example, for such and such a person, for what they are. The good life is forbidden. Then we must sit down for a moment and start again our reflection. What does it mean if we think here that some people are straight away excluded from the possibility of a happy life? So that's what the welcome carries. It is not a condescending welcome. Oh, poor you! You know, I welcome you. That's the minimum. That's the least I can do for you. I welcome you, but I'll keep my thoughts to myself. So that's not what it's about. I welcome you because I believe that your life can be good. It's a gift given to the other
dans le fait que
that this faith in the fact that his life can be beautiful,
peut être juste,
can be just,
peut être bonne.
can be good.
Sans doute pas à l'aune
And
de
it's
ce
not
que nous pensons,
measured against what we think,
qui est vrai pour tout le monde,
which is true for everyone,
mais
but
pourtant bonne.
a good life, nonetheless.
D'où ce qu'il dit dans l'interview aux revues
And
jésuites,
what
la problématique
the Pope says in the interview, the problem of
d'accompagner, c'est
being
prendre
with,
le pas de l'autre.
and to
Si
be
vous
with
prenez
someone
le
is
pas de
to
l'autre,
walk the same step. If you're too far behind,
vous courez devant,
or if you're running
il y a
ahead,
longtemps que vous l'avez perdu.
then you've lost the other.
Donc prendre le pas de l'autre,
So
se mettre à
to walk at the same speed as the other.
attitude qui, puisqu'il n'est
An
nullement,
attitude,
nullement en question,
because
pour remettre en cause
it's not,
la
we're not
doctrine
questioning the doctrine here
de l'Église
of the
sur
church
cette question,
on this issue.
qui n'a à voir avec aucun laxisme ou aucun
So it's
relativisme, au contraire.
nothing to do with
Elle est
relativism or laxism.
exigeante pour le croyant,
It is a lot more taxing for the believer because it asks the believer
devant son Dieu,
to entertain a truth with himself, with his God, but especially with himself. Is it true
décision,
that the believer is capable to take this decision
prendre le pas,
to walk alongside the other?
de ne pas d'emblée projeter
Not to straight away project
ses propres catégories
one's own categories and prejudices
sur l'autre.
on the other.
Ces images éventuellement toutes faites,
These ready-made images
qui qu'ils puissent
on the
être
other,
d'ailleurs.
whoever the other may be.
Alors, une fois dit ceci, essayons donc de
So
poursuivre
let's try to move forward.
très rapide
And a few very brief,
préalable.
a brief preamble.
Tout d'abord, premier d'entre eux, je ne m'étendrai
And the
sur
first
aucun
one,
d'eux,
and I won't take too long, and we can come back to them later on in the debate, but that's not the cutting edge of our subject tonight. That
la question de
really has to do with the issue of life according to the gospel.
l'homosexualité, ou plutôt les homosexualités.
Homosexualities,
Terme
if
très
we want
moderne,
to
hein,
keep this very modern term,
ont toujours existé.
they have always existed throughout all societies and throughout history.
Une science éminemment
So
récente.
statistics are a recent science, so it's difficult to make comparisons.
Est-ce qu'il y aurait
to say that,
plus de personnes homosexuelles?
Would there be more homosexuals today than yesterday in this or that society?
On peut peut-être le dire sur une
We may be able to say that over one or two generations, but
de façon plus lointaine, hein, historiquement.
if we go back in history, it becomes very difficult.
Témoignent tous les historiens,
But all historians say that
cette caractéristique,
this characteristic has always existed.
donc elle n'est pas l'invention comme telle
So it's not an invention ex nihilo
occidentale,
of a Western society or a perverted society, no more than
Océanie,
an Oceanian society or a
nord-africaine.
North African society or an Asian one. No,
Elle est le fait de toutes les cultures,
it belongs to all cultures,
l'histoire,
all histories,
et elle a subi
and
des temps
throughout history and in those cultures, it has gone through a number of variations and appreciations. In other words, some cultures and some eras have accepted it,
d'autres plus nombreuses,
others, more numerous, have repressed it,
parfois durement,
sometimes very harshly.
mais cela étant, elle a toujours été.
But it has always existed.
Donc nous avons toujours un croisement
So we always have
pour ce
a crossing.
de circonstances comme pour d'autres entre
In,
la situation de la personne
so we have the situation of the
et bien sûr,
person,
la
and
façon
of
dont
course
la
the way in which society
société
reacts,
dont la famille réagit,
including the family, the way the family reacts.
et comme les familles font partie
And
des
since
institutions sociales,
families are part of the social institutions,
sont pleinement dans la société,
They are
dans les sociétés
fully
qu'ils habitent,
integrated to the societies in which they inhabit, and they have different sensitivities, but
fort diverses à travers
these reactions can be very different according to different times of history,
du répressif.
and the repressive reaction is the dominant one.
Donc plus une société est répressive,
So the more a society is repressive,
les personnes
the
homosexuelles
more
ayant
homosexual people
une pratique homosexuelle,
who
vivant avec
live
quelqu'un,
homosexual practices, who live with someone having homosexual relations, will do it
cachée,
in a hidden way.
donc plus on pourra faire croire que ceci n'existe pas.
So the more you can make believe that it doesn't exist, of course, it isn't true.
Bon. Autre, simplement, point liminaire,
Another liminal point, which is
lapidaire pour le coup.
it's going to be very short as well.
Je pense qu'il faut essayer de tordre le cou à une idée.
I think we should kill the idea that there is a kind of a massive homosexuality of only one type, and that in a certain way all homosexual people are the same or are alike
d'être homosexuel.
by this characteristic of being homosexual.
Ceci ne nous viendrait pas à l'idée,
It wouldn't cross our mind, I think, to say this about heterosexual people.
il y a des manières.
There are several ways. I'm thinking in terms of respect here, because there are disrespectful ways
Violence.
and violent ways. But let's remain within respectful
Des
relations.
façons de vivre,
There are ways of living,
son amour avec
one's
son
love
conjoint du sexe
with
opposé.
one's partner of the opposite sex,
Personne ne penserait
and
que
no one
l'hétérosexualité
would dare to think that heterosexuality would be an instinct, a monolithic instinct.
va à peu près
To tell the truth, it's the same thing for
donc
heterosexualities.
plusieurs formes
So
d'homosexualité.
there are several forms of homosexualities. Sorry,
Si entrer dans les détails.
I won't go into
Je pense
detail,
qu'il est
but
toujours assez nécessaire
it's always necessary to talk in the plural
pour nombre de choses.
for many different things, including the most sensitive
Même,
ones.
sans doute en compréhension, peut-être aussi en respect,
And so we gain a better comprehension and more respect as well
sujet singulier.
than to speak in the singular.
Quand les personnes sont organisées,
Including when people are organized as communities or lobbies, to use a term the Pope was using.
qu'elles n'ont pas forcément
These people
dans la même expression
don't have the same expression
de leur homosexualité.
of their homosexuality.
Et sans doute, selon les cultures,
And maybe, according to different cultures,
peut-on aussi
no
trouver
doubt,
des
we
variantes
can find strong variations between the expression of homosexuality here
ou l'expression de
or
l'homosexualité
the expression of homosexualities in metropolitan France or in the US, in Asia
ou en Iran.
or Iran.
Donc, un peu de complexité
And so a little complexity doesn't hurt.
va avec une autre question
And with that
fondamentale
comes another fundamental question,
qui est
which is
d'admettre
to admit
que l'orientation de la sexualité n'est
that
pas
sexual
une décision
orientation
de personne.
is not a decision.
Personne de nous dans cette
No one in this room,
cause,
I'm guessing,
je peux le croire,
I believe it,
a décidé de
has
l'orientation
decided of their sexual orientation,
d'être hétérosexuel,
being heterosexual or homosexual,
rester à ces deux
to remain with this binary distinction. No
Ceci
more.
relève d'une histoire très première.
It comes from a very primal history, to remain in this work hypothesis of clinicians.
De la toute petite enfance.
It goes back to early childhood,
De travaux sur
and there are plenty of works about the eventuality about a genetic predisposition.
alors, on peut
So we can kill this idea because it is not verified at the moment, but there are works still being done on this issue. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is to accept that this issue has nothing to do with freedom or will. There is no decision that one takes once they turn 18. Oh, I can vote, and at the same time I'm going to decide whether I'm a heterosexual or a homosexual. Am I going to decide whether I'm more a man or a woman? No, it doesn't work that way. That doesn't work exactly like that in our lives. In other words, the person whose sexual orientation happens to be homosexual does not have any responsibility regarding that orientation. It is not something that is wanted. And so the question that about the way of living with an ethical dimension, this question is not that of orientation, but what am I going to do with myself? In other words, for each and every one of us, how can I live with what I am? How can I live with my luggage? And this luggage is always big, and heavy. It's my culture, my family, my environment, the time in which I live, my sex, of course, my sexual orientation. And I'm going to pause here, because I was going to say, if I know what it is, because I've been listening to people for over 25 years on these issues, and I know that sometimes, including for young adults, it is far from being clear. So sexual orientation is part of that luggage, but it cannot be isolated. And so you see that when we're talking about homosexuals, we're being very restrictive because we reduce the other to his sexual orientation, something that we would never do for heterosexual people, or at least that we do by contrast. But even if we're talking about heterosexual people, this is what we're doing tonight, we're stressing one characteristic of sexuality, but it's not the whole sexuality which is summarized or reduced to sexual orientation. This very complex question that we're debating at the moment here, over these few days, what it means to be a man, to be a woman, to become a man or to become a woman. And I dare to think that this question is essential in terms of sexual orientation. In front of me here, I can see men and women. And apparently of different generations. I see men and women, and I don't want to see anything else. I don't want to start seeing heterosexuals and homosexuals, just men and women. So the prism and the reduction of the question to sexual orientation as to what would be essential to the definition of the subject, because this orientation would be that of homosexuality, we must question ourselves, especially when there's a number of militant groups who want to defend what they believe to be their rights.
façon
and
très
what they
forte,
put
parfois,
forward
c'est
sometimes in a very strong and exclusive
cette
way,
caractéristique.
this
Pas
characteristic.
une raison en quelque sorte.
This is no reason to.
Donc là aussi, je ne peux que vous inviter.
So I can only
C'est pas
invite you to,
un exercice,
and it's not a literary exercise,
essayer de
but
ne jamais oublier
invite you to try never to forget that this orientation first is part of a sexuality which is not reduced to this characteristic, even though it might be very important, what is undeniable.
appartient à l'ensemble
But
de la
especially
personnalité.
it belongs to the whole of a personality.
Les parents
I've been listening to parents for a long time,
d'enfants dont l'orientation est
parents
homosexuelle,
of children whose sexual orientation are homosexual,
parfois des adultes.
and most of them are adults, sometimes 40 years of age.
Chacun
And
raconte
it's extraordinary. Everyone tells their own story, and at the same time,
des éléments se retrouvent de façon
you find
presque étrange.
the same elements in a strange way that are common to all the stories, and nearly all of them say how
Il y a comme un avant et un après.
there is a before and an after in the announcement by their children, and that all the questions that come afterwards
Était autour de la sexualité. Et
had
parfois,
to do with sexuality, and sometimes for years, as if
leur enfant
from overnight, their child, let's imagine he's a teacher, someone who likes to run and go to the movies, was no longer a teacher, no longer liked his job, no longer liked the cinema, no longer liked to run, and no longer liked, I don't know, literature, and wasn't a Christian anymore.
se résume
Meaning that life would be reduced
à cette question.
to this question.
Alors on comprend bien
So
la place du choc. Hein,
we understand that there is a shock, that there is emotion, that there is worry,
qui provoque
that this triggers this
obsession.
obsession, quasi-obsession. But we can also imagine if we, the person concerned, how difficult it can be to feel that all of a sudden your closest relatives reduce you to this characteristic,
Si tout ce que vous
as if
partagiez avec eux
all that you shared with them up until then
plus aucun poids
had no more weight
pour eux.
for them.
Donc, encore une fois, cette
So once again,
caractéristique
this characteristic
se situe toujours
is always within
Donc,
a larger
évaluer,
personality.
si on peut prendre ce terme,
So evaluating, if we can use this term,
évaluer de cette
evaluating this question supposes
prendre soin,
to take care,
de prendre attention
to be very careful
de comment elle va se situer dans
of
l'ensemble
how it's going to situate itself in the whole of in a personality as a whole, and not to isolate it,
ou de ne pas faire que tout le reste aurait
or,
disparu
or not to act as if everything else had disappeared
chez elle.
in,
Si désormais,
for that
elle
person,
n'était plus que cela.
as if that person was only that.
Comme le mot homosexualité, y
But
compris
since the word homosexuality, including in French, I seem to understand that it's more complicated in the Tahitian language, but
quand même
in French,
sur le sexe,
the stress is put on sex,
ce qui est d'ailleurs pour d'autres raisons un problème,
which is a problem for other reasons, but
sexualité,
to stress the word sexuality
mine de rien, on entend le sexuel.
means you hear
Là, ça
the
n'est
word
pas
sexual.
en jeu, mais c'est ce qu'on entend
That's not the only thing that's at stake, but that's what you hear.
bien avant
Long before
que d'entendre
you hear
que c'est d'abord de la question
that it's
d'aimer dont il
a
s'agit.
question of love first,
Et que là encore,
and that once again you would not,
nous n'aurions pas cette écoute aussi sélective
you wouldn't have such a selective hearing concerning
personnes dont l'orientation est
people whose orientation would be heterosexual and who come to tell you
sont tombées amoureuses.
that they fell in love. For example, if it's a young girl fell in love with a boy,
Du quartier d'à côté,
you know,
vous
the
êtes
boy next door,
horrifié ou au
and
contraire,
you'd be horrified or very happy, you know, depending on the characteristics of the young man. But what you don't hear
répondre à la question
at first the sexual question, even though it is present.
Mais vous allez d'abord entendre
But first you're going to hear
des choses ayant à voir avec
something that has to do with
l'amour.
what we call love,
C'est ce qu'on peut leur souhaiter.
and that's what we wish anyway.
Donc à la fois, il ne faut pas noyer le poisson,
So
faire comme si
we shouldn't act as if all this was natural and as long as you love each other, there's no problem in this world.
ça, si c'était vrai, ça serait vrai.
If that were true, we would know about that there are problems.
Mais en même temps, à
But at the same time, at the other end of the spectrum,
avoir ce type
to have this type
de lecture
of reading or hearing
peut être extrêmement
can be extremely
problématique,
problematic,
peut être violent pour les
violent for the
peut être extrêmement
people concerned,
puissant. Et
can be
combien de fois
hurtful.
j'ai entendu des
And
parents
how many times have I heard parents telling me,
mais enfin, on
but
dirait que dans l'Église,
it,
vous ne pensez donc
it,
qu'au
it,
sexe,
it looks like within the church you're only thinking of sex because you don't imagine that our children love each other
vous savez
and that the
parler
only thing that you can talk about
à propos des textes, c'est
about the scriptures are sexual acts.
Je pense que, voilà, la moindre des choses que je
I
puisse
think that the
faire,
least I can do
c'est entendre cette
is to
question,
hear this question,
recevoir et
to receive it,
d'essayer de-
and to try to work on it and take care,
pas d'éviter
not to avoid the subject, far from it, but to relocate
d'abord cet enjeu de fond
the stakes.
qui est comment
which
est-il
are
possible d'aimer.
How is it possible to
Parce que
love?
s'il est une question évangélique,
Because if there is a gospel-based question
pour les chrétiens,
for Christians, that is it.
comment est-il
How
possible,
is it possible to love?
depuis la condition singulière de
From
chacun,
the unique condition
comment
of
lui
each of
est-il
us,
possible
how
d'aimer?
is it possible to love?
Comment lui est-il possible d'aimer son Dieu,
How is it possible to love one's God if one is a Christian,
d'aimer l'autre,
to love
les autres aussi,
the others,
et de s'aimer lui-même,
and to love oneself,
ce qui est parfois sans doute
which is sometimes the hardest and most painful and longest work.
donc pas de responsabilité
So,
ni de
no
liberté sur la condition,
responsibility or freedom
sur l'orientation
on
de
the
la
condition
sexualité, mais par
or
contre,
the
évidemment,
orientation of sexuality, but
très spécifique,
except for very specific situations.
une liberté sur la manière,
A freedom
sur ce que je fais avec ce que je suis,
in the way of what I do with what I am,
sur la façon dont je décide.
and the way that I decide I'm going to live my life.
Là, heureusement,
And
il y a
thankfully,
liberté.
there is freedom.
Pas que de la liberté, mais
Not just freedom, but there is
liberté.
freedom.
Ce que le christianisme affirme,
That's what the Christian faith asserts.
alors, à partir de ces quelques
So, from these few
propositions ou réflexions,
propositions or reflections or data,
si j'essaie de penser
if I try to think
qu'est-ce qui justement peut être
what
proposé
can be offered
depuis une lecture croyante,
from a Christian reading, a Catholic reading,
la tradition
because
chrétienne que je
the
connais le
Christian
mieux,
tradition that I know best
donc
is,
je n'oserais vraiment pas m'avancer.
and I wouldn't venture for other
Donc,
faiths.
qu'est-il possible de proposer?
What can we offer?
Peut-être y a-t-il 3 écueils à éviter.
Maybe there are three difficulties we should avoid.
Bon, vous verrez, mais
And for me, at least, you can make your own opinion, but
au moins pour moi.
at least for myself.
Je pense qu'il faut
First of all, I think
comprendre que distinguer
one must
ne
be
veut pas
able
forcément dire
to understand that to distinguish does not mean to discriminate in the political sense that was given, and rightly so, to this term.
il faut distinguer pour penser.
One must distinguish in order to think.
Si tout est dans tout et réciproquement,
If everything is in everything,
nous pensons plus maintenant.
we're no longer thinking and we're no longer talking.
Ce que l'on distingue tout d'abord, ce sont des
So
mots.
what we distinguish at first are words, so that we may link them together to make sentences and to build a grammar.
Donc distinguer n'est pas forcément discriminer.
So distinguishing does not necessarily mean discriminating, so please.
Donc distinguer n'est pas forcément
So
exclure.
to make a distinction does not mean to exclude,
Pas forcément être
doesn't
homophobe.
necessarily mean you're homophobic.
Deuxième écueil,
And second problem,
imaginez qu'il faudrait forcément se couler
imagine that we'd have to conform
les évolutions ou
to,
dans ce que l'on estime
the,
être les
evolutions
évolutions dans la perception que nous
or
avons.
one's perception of the evolutions of
Société,
our societies,
famille, que
our
sais-je.
families, what do I know?
Donc éviter une tentation
So avoid the
pathologique,
temptation
comme si le sens de
as
l'histoire
if the
était forcément
sense of history
le progrès de
had to be a sense of progress for humanity,
tout changement
as if any change
était forcément de l'ordre
had to be
d'un progrès d'humanité.
a progress for
Ils
humanity.
ne sont pas forcément contre, hein, mais
They're not necessarily against it,
de là
but
à penser qu'ils vont
to
systématiquement
think that they're going to systematically,
apparaître le plus juste
in the just sense, and without them being examined.
pas le soupçon
The problem is not suspicion, which I think is
du
hateful
point de vue chrétien,
from a Christian perspective.
de soupçonner le monde, de soupçonner la modernité.
Suspicion towards the word and modernity.
C'est la lucidité.
But
Par contre, ça me paraît une exigence.
clear thinking is a necessary requirement, being lucid.
Pas de raison,
So there's,
plutôt toutes les raisons pour ne pas
but
d'emblée.
we have plenty of reasons not to think that any type of evolution would be just.
Tant et tant d'exemples, hein, si nous
And
sommes
there could be so many examples if we went outside the field of today's conference, like financial issues regarding the planet and the evolutions in that domain, and the place of finance in our world. It didn't necessarily bring the greatest progress, the greatest human progress in terms of social justice. And at the same time,
de tenter au moins d'éviter une tentation.
trying to avoid this temptation, there would be an evolution of. It would be a problem as well to think the evolution of.
Faire comme si forcément l'évolution des mœurs était mauvaise.
To pretend that our evolution in the historical term was bad,
Que je viens de dire précédemment,
and say the opposite of what I said earlier,
comme si c'était forcément mieux avant,
as if it was better before
dans l'Église que dans le monde,
in the church or in the world,
que dans votre culture peut-être.
or in your culture maybe.
Je pense que vraiment, c'est pas mieux.
I don't think it's better.
Et nous savons bien combien les sociétés
And we know that yesterday's societies
discriminantes,
could be discriminating
la politique,
in the political sense of the term, could be unjust, brutal.
pour ne pas les idéaliser,
And so we know this, and we don't idealize them today
notre propre.
because we're questioning our own societies.
Donc un regard qui tenterait
So,
de chemin de
We
lucidité
would try to find a way of thinking clearly in a benevolent way
et des communautés,
towards communities and
mais
persons,
d'une bienveillance, les yeux ouverts. Donc d'une
but
bienveillance.
with our eyes
de
open.
l'ordre de la
So
compréhension.
benevolence wouldn't be the same as compromission.
Donc c'est forcément
compromise.
une mais
So it's a way along the ridge.
vivre, je ne sais pas, mais que c'était là que se plaçait la vie chrétienne.
And I know that this is where Christian life is placed, on the ridge.
Les autoroutes ne sont guère faites pour elles.
Highways are not made for Christian life.
Ça peut aider dans d'autres circonstances.
It can help in other circumstances.
Alors, que proposer donc,
So what can we offer
à partir de ce que je viens
from
d'évoquer?
what I've
Si on fait un
exposed?
je ne m'en rends pas du tout compte, donc je voudrais me
I
dire,
don't realize, you have to tell me how much time I have left.
je suis très très loin de la fin, donc il faut que je...
I know I'm a long way from the end,
Je vais-
but I
Il n'y a
can,
pas de souci. Hein. Parce que comme il y a longtemps que je ne regarde plus mon papier, si j'ose dire,
because I haven't looked at my paper for a while, so what do I have, 10 minutes? Okay.
ça va, vous êtes toujours vivant.
Are you still with me? You still alive? Good.
Si je regarde un instant vraiment très rapidement, du coup,
And if I look now very quickly,
discuter,
and we'll talk about it later, but
dire la Bible.
what the Bible has to say.
Je peux que vous conseiller d'étudier. Donc, comme c'est
I can only advise you to study, and we don't have time tonight. You'll go to
proposé, par exemple,
Bible studies offered by this great institution in theology
dans les textes, ce
to actually look at the scriptures and see what the issue is.
celles et ceux qui connaissent.
So those of you who know, please forgive me.
Juste un mot.
Just a word.
Ça n'est pas là l'obsession de la Bible.
It is not an obsession for the Bible.
Le sujet de la Bible,
The subject of the Bible,
heureusement, il n'y en a pas
and
un, sinon
thankfully there's not just one, just the revelation of God.
mais vraiment n'est pas la sexualité,
So it's not sexuality, and even less homosexuality or homosexualities,
complètement anachronique.
which is an anachronistic term.
Donc déjà, donc n'y cherchez pas.
So for a start,
vous ne trouverez pas.
don't start looking for something you will not find.
Donc n'essayez pas d'aller
And so,
verser grâce à Wikipédia.
Don't try looking for a verse thanks to Wikipedia or some other means and say, oh, look, I've found the verse that matches
Dans la Genèse, au chapitre
in
19,
Genesis chapter 19 or
18 puis Lévitique.
chapter 18 of Leviticus. No,
Voilà. Parce que la Bible se
the,
respecte.
the Bible must be respected, and to be respected,
Il faut entrer
one
texte,
must enter the
entrer dans
scriptures,
l'histoire,
enter
entrer dans leur
stories,
interprétation
their interpretation,
pour pouvoir interpréter,
to be able to interpret
tenter d'interpréter
and try to interpret
ce qu'ils disent. Donc,
what
la
it says.
ramener à
So
un dictionnaire de
to reduce
citation
it to a dictionary of quotes
est une hérésie.
is a heresy as much as a lie.
En même temps,
At the same time,
à plusieurs endroits
in several places,
où des histoires ou des textes de
stories or law texts like the Leviticus will mention not homosexuality, but
qu'on peut qualifier dans
will
notre
talk
langage à
about
nous
acts
d'homosexuels.
that we can qualify as homosexual. It's never qualified like that in the Bible. It's not part of the lexicon,
De
but
relations sexuelles
of
homosexuelles.
sexual relations
Rarement des relations
that are homosexual.
simplement homosexuelles.
So it's rarely simply homosexual relations. Very often it's linked to rape,
Conduite violente, donc c'est
violent conduct. So it's not that easy to qualify. But if we had to use one word, nowhere in the Bible, the Bible doesn't say anything good about it. There is no text,
un verset
not one verse
qui ferait qu'on pourrait penser
that would make us think that the Bible has something good to say about that.
il n'est pas possible
So
de dire si simplement
it
que
isn't
ça,
possible to say
l'on dit du mal.
that it says something negative,
Premier Testament,
because the subject is about justice in
ce que nous
the
avons fait, ce que nous faisons encore.
what we have done, what we're still doing with poor people,
L'étranger,
the widow, the stranger, the orphan,
plus,
more than
1000 fois plus,
1,000 times more
que de cette
than this
question.
issue.
Il faut y regarder de près.
So if we have to look closely, and I can only invite you to do so,
Allez lire quand même au moins les versets
at
au-dessus
least
et
you
les
should
versets en dessous.
read the verses above and below. If you're not reading the whole book,
Au moins le chapitre.
read the chapter at least.
Si vous prenez le
So
Genèse,
if you take Genesis and chapter 19 or Leviticus, at least read the whole of chapter 18 and 19. That's the least you can do.
en tout cas, si vous faites cela,
So if you do this, you will see that at no time these acts are qualified as just. And we're talking about the acts, not the persons. The Bible is not interested in the persons, it's interested in the acts. Because these acts have to do
ces actes sont dans des séries, souvent, pas
with,
toujours,
very often they're included in series that are connected to idolatry.
en grande partie,
And that's why
qu'elles sont réprouvées.
that's why they're denounced.
Parce qu'il y a quelque chose
This idolatry
qui l'auteur, les auteurs,
because there is something for the author or authors, does not honor
quelque chose lié
something that is linked to the differentiated creation.
Mais je m'arrête là parce que je voudrais pas
But I'll stop here because I don't want you to
phosphorer à partir de ce que je dis et
to start thinking about what I'm saying and
à en tirer des conséquences
draw conclusions that would be too quick and wouldn't be respectful
du texte dans
of
son
the text
historicité.
in its historicity.
Il s'agit de textes
These are texts that, for some of them,
7 siècles.
are more than 7 centuries old. So
Ils méritent et le détour et le
So
respect. Mais en
they
tout cas,
they
simplement
need to
pour
be
les
read and
textes,
respected.
on se trompe,
But
il n'y a pas de versets
there are no verses
qui parlent
that deal with conducts,
sexuels,
sexual conducts or homosexual conducts in positive
Du
terms.
côté du Nouveau Testament, c'est encore plus
In
vrai.
the New Testament, it's even shorter because
Vous trouverez
you will find occurrences
Paul
only for Paul,
et à peu près la
and
seule
it's about the only one in the letter to the Romans, chapter 1,
où, à nouveau,
in which, again,
la parole de Paul est une parole très
the
dure.
word of Paul is very hard about conducts, about behaviors,
Très dure.
very
Il n'y a
harsh.
pas que pour les conduites
Not just for homosexual behaviors, it qualifies many other
bien d'autres conduites
behaviors
en même temps. Hein.
at the same time.
Donc, on ne peut pas se servir du texte
So we cannot use the
pour
text
venir appuyer
to support
une sorte de
kind of
mauvaise tolérance, de tolérance facile,
facile tolerance.
sur, encore une fois, les conduites. Mais
Once again, about behaviors.
ça, c'est ce que me disent les gens, mais oui, mais
And
c'est
that's
pas
what people
conduite,
say. They say, yeah, it's about behaviors, but so what do we do?
puisqu'on n'a pas choisi
Since we haven't chosen
d'être homosexuel.
to be homosexuals.
Voilà. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on fait?
So what do we do?
À cette question-là,
And that question,
le texte biblique répond pas comme
the
tel.
biblical text does not answer directly,
Il répondrait
but it doesn't answer directly to any
pour l'hétérosexualité.
for heterosexuality.
Mais il va pourtant répondre quand même.
But it does answer
Il va répondre sur l'art d'aimer.
about the art of loving.
Et la meilleure manière de s'interroger
And the
comment
best way
répondre sur l'art d'aimer,
to
c'est
question
de
that
regarder comment Jésus
is to
aime.
look at how Jesus loves,
C'est quand même ce qui intéresse un chrétien.
because that's what's interesting
Et donc,
for a
on peut
Christian,
regarder de près
to
dans
look
l'Évangile
closely through
comment
the
Jésus
gospel
aime.
to see how
Comment
Jesus
il aime
loves,
son Père.
how he loves his Father,
Ceci veut dire
and what it means in his existence,
que la précédence du Père,
that the
d'être
precedence
précédé
of the Father,
par le
to be
Père,
preceded by the
précédé.
Father, to refer to the Father,
Comment il aime celles et ceux qui le
how does he love his followers?
Comment il aime
How does he
celles et
love
ceux qu'il rencontre.
the ones he meets?
Et jusqu'où
And
cet amour
how
va
far
le mener. Et
this love is going to lead him.
ceci, là, est fait pour tout le monde.
And this is valid for everyone.
Personne n'en est dispensé,
No one is exempted.
pas plus que des personnes n'y auraient pas accès.
And everyone has access to it.
Pour tout le monde.
It's valid for everyone.
Donc la seule manière,
So the only just way,
éthiquement parlant,
ethically speaking,
quant à l'art de vivre,
in terms of the art of living for each and every one of us, and to question ourselves as to how the biblical text can teach us
mon existence
and inform my existence,
peut instruire
can
l'existence
inform the existence of someone with whom I'm talking, that I'm walking with, someone close,
et dans l'orientation de la sexualité.
whose sexual orientation is homosexual and who's also a Christian.
C'est de revenir à la
The only way is to come back to the way Jesus is.
C'est assez simple, hein,
It's quite simple.
à vivre moins, mais
Less simple to live this way,
si on
but
regarde en 2 minutes aussi.
If we have a
Ce
quick
que
look
le
at
magistère
what
de l'Église catholique.
the Catholic texts have to say,
Les textes de Rome, si vous voulez.
the text from Rome, if we want to summarize.
Là encore, ils sont
Once
peu
again,
nombreux,
not that
mais
many of
ils
them,
sont tous unanimes.
but they're all
Ils sont
unanimous.
tous unanimes
They're all
à
unanimous
condamner,
in condemning
en tout cas,
and disapproving the acts,
homosexuels,
the homosexual acts.
et en même temps,
And at the same time,
depuis le début des années 80,
since the beginning of the 80s, 1980s,
à rendre compte que l'attitude
to
pastorale dit
say that the pastoral attitude must be one of welcome,
une attitude d'accueil inconditionnelle
unconditional
et doit prendre
welcome,
en compte la
and must take into
complexité
account the complexity of existence,
et que cette complexité
and that this complexity is valid for everyone. It's not just for people of
que toutes nos histoires sont quand même un peu
a certain
articulées.
sexual orientation.
Pas que celle de certains qui seraient très très enfin celle de certains peut
All
être très
our stories are
nos histoires sont embellies. Donc, il y a
complex.
pas les purs et les impurs.
So it's not a question of some of us being pure and others being impure.
Mais une fois qu'on a dit cela,
But once you've said this, which is important and necessary,
qui souligne
which underlines that
le texte
the fact that the biblical text,
quand il s'agit des
when we're
explicites des
talking
actes,
about explicit
ou
acts
des textes du magistère,
or
le
texts
texte
from the
insiste sur les
magister,
actes. On peut dire, mais
the fact that it insists on the acts, we might say, oh, this is really an obsession. Or we can say,
tant mieux,
right, that this is
parce
good,
que justement, il n'y a
because there is no judgment
à porter sur les
on the persons.
On peut donc aussi considérer que
So we can consider it's a piece of luck, because
rend compte que l'Église
this tells us that the church
ne dit donc rien
says nothing, or at least nothing specific,
sur le fait
about the fact
d'une
that
personne homosexuelle,
one is homosexual
d'être une personne
or
hétérosexuelle. La question est,
heterosexual.
encore une fois, dans le
The issue
comment je vis,
is how do I live,
mais pas ce que je suis.
but not what I am.
Donc, on peut le prendre du bon côté.
So we can take it the right way. We can hear it
Ainsi.
like this.
Ce qui m'amène à ma
Which
conclusion.
brings me to my
Ça va,
conclusion, or at least it will be my conclusion tonight.
avant notre fort provisoire et avant notre discussion.
Temporary conclusion before our discussion. And my conclusion is
De m'interroger sur
to question myself
une
about
seule
one and only question,
que
really,
nous pourrions partager
that we can share
pour les uns et pour les autres.
for everyone.
C'est-à-dire pour les personnes
And
homosexuelles.
by that I mean for homosexual
à vrai dire,
people,
pour tout le monde.
but also for
Souvent,
everyone.
des questions
Because very often the questions that concern homosexual people, many of them,
ces questions
many of these questions also apply to each and every one of us, and I was able to verify this dozens and dozens of times.
La question c'est
The question is, how do I
une
accept
incomplétude.
something that is
Comment
incomplete?
j'accepte
How do
que
I
je ne
accept
suffis pas
the fact
à
that
moi-même?
I am not sufficient for myself?
Est-ce que je peux consentir? Est-ce que la vie chrétienne peut m'aider? Parce que
Can
c'est pas une
Christian
question
life help
de
me?
renoncement.
So it's not about renouncing in the heavy sense of the word, where it would drag us down. We have to live with our heart condition,
Rien à
and
voir. Non,
that's it. No,
c'est pas cela.
it's not that.
C'est comment est-ce que la vie évangélique,
It's how does gospel-based
parce que
life,
croyant que chacun
because we're believers we believe that each and every one of us
et
is
intégralement
completely
aimé de Dieu,
loved by God,
qu'il l'est intégralement, que cet amour
that
le précède,
this love always precedes the person,
l'accompagne, le précède.
accompanies him
Cet
and
amour est
precedes him.
inconditionnel.
So this love is unconditional.
Donc, comment pouvoir croire
So how can we
Enfin,
believe?
c'est possible de
Is it
croire.
possible to
Oui,
believe
réel,
in one's real life,
sa foi,
in,
dans sa manière de vivre,
in one's way of living,
de croire
to believe this,
peut donner, de
to believe that
consentir
this can give,
à ce que je suis, et donc de consentir à ce qui me manque.
to consent to what I am, and so to consent to what is lacking for me, to consent to what is lacking for me. I'm struck by this
Dans l'écoute que je peux
in my
j'essaie d'avoir
the hearing I'm trying to develop over the years, listening to homosexual people.
sur une quête
There is a quest which sometimes is never ending,
de reconnaissance.
a quest for recognition.
Alors, je laisse de côté,
So
c'est difficile
I
parce
have
que
to leave aside, and it's difficult because you can't cut yourself into pieces, but the question of access to political rights, civil rights,
bien sûr, comme nous sommes
and
des êtres mêlés,
because we're complex beings, we cannot isolate and slice our intimate lives, our interiority, our social life.
mais
We cannot cut all this into slices, but at least we must make distinctions. So if we leave aside what can be heard by some and not by others, and that would be necessary rights,
Mais du point de vue du sujet,
but from the perspective of the subject, and in that case the believer, the Christian,
s'il est vrai que je peux croire, parce qu'encore faut-il que
if it's true that I can believe, because I have to be told, if no one tells me,
en témoignant, évidemment, je n'en-
I won't believe it.
mais si je peux croire,
But if I
en
can
effet,
believe
inconditionnellement aimé
that
par Dieu, alors
God's love for me is unconditional,
consente
is it possible
à ce que je ne suis pas.
that I consent to what I am not,
Consente à ne pas pouvoir
that I
être,
consent to not being able to be everything,
que je consente à ce qui
that
me
I
manque.
consent to what is lacking
Peut-être que
for me? Then maybe
si ici une histoire
a tale, a story,
vraie pour tout un chacun parmi nous,
which would be true for each and every one of us,
est sûrement
is
la lutte
the struggle
de Jacob avec
of
l'ange.
Jacob with the angel.
Toute la nuit, il
All night he fought.
au matin,
In the morning,
enfin, le combat s'arrête.
the fight ends.
Le combat s'arrête
The fight ends
par la bénédiction.
through the blessing.
L'ange
The angel
le
blesses
bénit, c'est-à-dire
Jacob
le sauve, hein,
and
tiré.
saves him in the sense of pulling him upwards.
Consentir à être béni.
To consent to being blessed.
Croire que l'on est béni.
To believe that one is blessed.
Et qu'alors, il est peut-être possible
And that it may be possible to move forward in life, maybe not perfectly, but to move forward
d'avancer avec ce que l'on
with what we are,
sans cesse
without always waiting
de nouvelles.
for new recognitions.
Question que je ne peux que
Question that
adresser à moi-même
I
d'abord,
can only address to myself at
qui
first,
s'adresse à chacun d'entre nous,
which is valid for each and every one of us, before it is addressed to people in particular,
les
that
personnes
would be
homosexuelles.
homosexual people.
Penser que ce chemin-là,
To think that this path,
de consentir à ne pas pouvoir tout avoir,
to consent to not being able to have everything,
est peut-être le seul
maybe
qui puisse être un chemin d'humanité.
the only path to humanity.
Je vous remercie.
And I thank you.